Tevinter Nights. Hunger by Brienne Battier and read by Kyle Bond. One here, one there. The trader who failed to turn up that summer. The cooper gone missing by the river. They thought accident, despite knowing better. They thought bad luck, which was closer. A month went by, enough to let them justify, to feel safe. The trader's father passed through that autumn in search of his missing son. A hunter went out and never returned. Another hunter clawed apart, left strewn across the path for them to find. Were they accidents now? Then came the sounds at night, the blood in the barn the next morning. The sounds came again 2 weeks later, followed by screams. Then again the following week. When they sounded again, she ran. "Are you hungry?" it asked itself. She ran. And it followed. The horses had already bolted. 5 Darkspawn blocked the road ahead, 3 Hurlocks with rust-spotted armor and chipped blades, and a pair of Genlocks, their bright mottled limbs exposed and thick with muscle. The lead Hurlock snarled, lips peeling up from gray teeth. It took a halting step toward the 2 gray Wardens, teasing them. Antoine held his bow loosely in one hand. This was it. His other hand hung by his side, fingers twitching, ready. The last and only time he'd fought Darkspawn, it hadn't gone well. He'd barely survived and lay near death for days before the Grey Wardens rescued him. He hadn't been a Grey Warden then, but he was now. And Grey Wardens stopped the monsters first. "We're outnumbered." Evka's dark eyes flicked to the left, her heightened senses alerting her to further danger. And surrounded. They didn't tell outsiders that part. That being a Grey Warden meant a ritual that connected you to the Darkspawn. That the strange song that runs through their heads will run through yours too. Antoine's own senses hummed. But he wasn't used to reading them. Instead, he was getting a mild headache. "That's bad, no?" "Only if we die," Evka said. She released a knife from her belt, turned and threw it at the Darkspawn's shriek that burst through the trees to their left. The shriek let out a sharp cry as the blade cut its arm. It raked a taloned hand at the dwarf, but Evka had already dived clear. She drew a short axe and squared off against the monster. The Darkspawn on the road ahead charged at Antoine. He tensed, but didn't move. 5 Darkspawn, narrow path. They were crowded together. "Avoiding death means doing something," Evka called. Almost, Antoine muttered. "Now!" Evka dodged another blow. Antoine reached into his pocket, pulled out a round glass vial, and threw it at the nearest Hurlock. The vial bounced off the Darkspawn's chest and onto the ground. The Hurlock blinked. Not exactly the plan, but there was always a backup. Once Antoine figured out what that backup was. "Antoine!" Evka shouted. The shriek screamed again, the sound almost enough to make their ears bleed. "Désolé. Sorry. That's not what it's supposed to do." Antoine sprang backward, knocking an arrow as he went, and fired. The shot went clean through the Hurlock's eye, bringing the Darkspawn down and ensuring the elf's head remained on his shoulders. Evka ripped her axe from the shriek's chest, turned and slid herself between Antoine and one of the Genlocks. Blood spattered across her face as her axe tore through thick flesh. Antoine knocked another arrow and fired over Evka's head into the monster's face. 2 Hurlocks and 1 Genlock left. Their odds were slightly better. Or they were better before the remaining Genlock flung out its arm, sending Antoine into a nearby tree. Dazed, Antoine heard Evka call his name again. She must have dealt with the Genlock because only the Hurlocks advanced on his fellow warden. As he picked himself up, his eyes landed on the glass container lying in the dust by Evka's feet. There it was. The backup plan. Antoine darted forward, a rock in hand. He barely registered Evka's startled expression before flinging himself to the ground, bringing the rock down on the vial. There was a sharp crack, and a dark cloud billowed up and outward, obscuring everything in its wake. "What?" "That's what it's supposed to do," Antoine cheered. "Have you ever heard of a warning?" Evka griped. But she'd already taken advantage of the disoriented Herlocks, bringing down the one closest to her. Antoine rolled back to his feet, drew his bow, and fired at the final Darkspawn. Black, sluggish blood spat from its teeth. It staggered and fell. As the cloud began to clear, Antoine broke the silence with his own relieved laughter. "Weishaupt's not a short walk," Evka noted. Antoine brushed off his coat, unconcerned. They'd fought 6 Darkspawn, and he was still on his feet. It was much better than almost dying. "Another detour," he said. Evka rolled her eyes. "There must be an inn nearby," Antoine said. The sound of thunder grumbled overhead. Warden Evka Ivo had grown up in Orzammar. The dwarven city was what it was. Stone floors, stone walls, stone ceilings. It never changed much. Her 3 years with the Grey Wardens had brought her to the surface, and she'd found a lot to love about life above ground. Being outside in the rain wasn't included. Being outside in the rain after dark was even worse. "Is it sore?" Antoine asked, catching Evka rubbing her shoulder. Evka glanced up at the elf. Knowing him, he'd found some guaranteed-to-work ointment at a roadside stand. "Nothing sleep won't fix. If we get any. Then we'll push on." "Are we late?" "Not yet," Evka said. "But we had horses this morning." Warden life was hardly predictable. She knew that. But nothing about Antoine's short time with the Wardens had been a straight line. After a hasty recruitment in Orlais, Evka was charged with taking the new recruit to a quiet outpost. They weren't halfway there when the messenger caught them. The summons called available Wardens to Weishaupt Fortress, the center of their order, located in the heart of the Anderfels. Evka and Antoine had crossed the vague border a few days ago, the landscape already taking on the bleak cliffs and ragged forests of the harsh northern country. "The vials need improvement," Antoine admitted. "But when it worked, it was interesting, no?" "It was," Evka conceded. Antoine grinned. "And you could have died," she added. "You've said that to me before," Antoine said. Teasing, as always. Evka winced. She'd been the one to find Antoine. He should have been dead. According to the other servants, they'd only escaped the Darkspawn because, quote, "that grinning lunatic distracted them," unquote. When the Wardens arrived, Antoine was 3/4 gone, and muttering to himself. Poisoned with Darkspawn blood. His only hope was to take the joining ritual and become a Grey Warden, if he could survive it. Turns out he could, and he'd been cheerful as a songbird ever since. Not the reaction she'd expected. Antoine gave her a sideways look, and changed the subject. "We saved the horses." "They ran away," Evka said. "From Darkspawn, which we defeated." "That doesn't—" Evka's retort was cut short by a young woman crashing through the trees and onto the road in front of them. Her forearms were bare, thin dark lines showing where she'd run through the branches, and sharp burrs clung to her skirt. At the sight of the Wardens, the woman spun away, slipped, and fell to the ground. "It's all right," Antoine said immediately. The woman clawed dark tangles of rain-plastered hair from her face and scrambled to her feet. Her eyes darted to the surrounding trees. Antoine took a step toward her. "We can help you." The woman gave a bitter laugh. "No, you won't," she said. "What's after you?" Evka asked. She nodded to Antoine, who readied his bow and scanned the surrounding woods. Given the late hour, overcast sky, and dense trees, it was impossible to see far. The woman's eyes fixed on the griffin insignia on Evka's chest. "Your Wardens." Wardens Antoine and Evka, Antoine said happily. Evka was surprised he didn't pair the announcement with a jaunty bow. And you are? Mina Bauer. The woman took a step closer. It's still out there. What is? Antoine said. We don't know, Mina said. People go missing, we find nothing, or it's not human. We know that. Could be Darkspawn, Evka said, more to Antoine than to Mina. She couldn't sense any nearby, but that didn't mean they weren't farther into the woods. Darkspawn, Mina said, turning the idea over. Her eyes lit up. Wardens have to fight Darkspawn. You're sworn to it. You'll go to Eichvale. It was almost an order, save for the anxious way she wrapped her arms around herself. This place you're from, Evka said. Eichvale, Mina said. Does it have a place we can get out of the rain? Yes. Then it's worth stopping by, Evka said. She expected Antoine to chime in, but instead he was standing still. Too still, staring intently into the dark woods, his expression troubled. Antoine. He shook his head, and that easy smile returned. Likely nothing. Another detour? Evka nodded, then turned to Mina. Lead on. It was nearly midnight when the path opened slightly and revealed their first view of Eichvale. The rain had passed, and in the thin moonlight, the village was small and colorless. What passed for the main road was little more than a lopsided mud track, lined with gray stone buildings. A large wooden statue met them at the village entrance, but whether it was a man, a bear, or holy Andraste herself was hard to say. The features weathered to nothing. The entire place looked run down, but steadily maintained, on the verge of collapse, yet oddly permanent. And the Wardens were here to save it. At least 2 of them were. To their left, a squat 2-story building crouched next to the road. Hazy yellow lights strained to extend from undersized windows. A worn sign showed only an angry round toad, the establishment's name long peeled away. Mina walked straight to the entrance and banged on the heavy wooden door. It swung open a crack, enough for a pale eye to appraise the people on the front step. Then, far enough for them to see a thin man with hunched shoulders and wisps of gray hair. Behind the man, a handful of drawn and tired villagers eyed the Wardens with wary distrust. "Back are ya? Figured you'd be dead," the man said. Mina looked ready to retort, but the man moved on. "Who are these, then?" "Grey Wardens," Mina said. "They're here to help." The man scratched at an itch behind his ear. "Wardens swear oaths," Mina said. Someone inside the inn snorted. Antoine stood a little straighter. This wasn't the welcome he'd expected. "You're the innkeeper?" He tried politely. "When there's time for it. Rest of the time I'm the tailor. Virshil." The man held out a hand, curled slightly with age, and Antoine shook it. Virshil nodded, grabbed a lantern from inside the door, and stepped past them out of the inn. Evka shrugged, and the Wardens fell in line behind him. "If you're here, Darkspawn's as good a guess as any," Virshil said. "Had those in my father's time." They followed Virshil up the muddy road, passing a few homes, a trade shop, and the blackened remains of a building that had caught fire and never been rebuilt. The small group from the inn followed, picking up a few more villagers along the way despite the late hour. "Tax started this summer," Virshil continued, as if updating the Wardens on the year's crop status. "Come every week now. Sometimes 2 or 3 times. Wager it'll be more than that soon enough." The road abruptly opened into a small market square, with a well at its center. They turned before reaching the large house that loomed at the end of it, its windows and doors boarded over. The track they followed was narrower and darker than the one they'd left. It stopped at a small house, gray like all the others. Herschel led them around to the back and gestured vaguely to a crooked shed. "There's Nights," he said. The door to the shed had burst inward. Splinters littered the floor. Wood-carving tools were scattered about, knocked and kicked from the stand that had held them. A swerving trail of dark brown led away from the pool of dried blood on the dusty floor. The trail disappeared when it left the shed, washed away by the rain. Mina watched the Wardens closely. She was shaking now, her arms wrapped around herself. The rest of the crowd hung back, trampling the remains of a garden. Evka went to work immediately. She knelt among the wreckage, observing the blood trail closely. "Who?" she asked simply. "My brother," Mina said. "Willem." Her level tone failed to cover the slight crack in her voice. "Mikolondion," Antoine murmured. "Go on," Herschel said. "You brought your help. That's enough." Mina didn't move, but tears threatened the corner of her eyes. The crowd stared. "The attacks," Antoine said loudly, drawing attention to himself. "What brought them on?" "It's this damned place," said a man with thick arms and tangled hair. "Bad luck all over." An elderly woman in a nightgown and overlarge boots bobbed in agreement. "Boy won't be the last." "We don't know he's dead," Mina cut in. "You didn't run for them." The elderly woman waved vaguely at Evka. "You ran. You knew." Mina paced away from the crowd, her fists clenched, then turned to Antoine. Her breath was coming faster now. "There's not always a body. Darkspawn take people, don't they? Sometimes?" Antoine wasn't sure. He hadn't died, but that was luck. They hadn't taken him either. "What chance does someone taken by Darkspawn have?" the man said. "None." "If there's a way," Mina began. "False hope's no good either," Herschel added. Antoine could answer that. "We don't know it's false yet," he said. He glanced back at Evka. They didn't know, did they? Evka stood, brushing the dust from her hands. "It's not Darkspawn." "What?" Mina spluttered. It has to. You can't." Antoine separated himself from the crowd and came to stand next to Evka. "But we saw them earlier today," he murmured. "Ride in, save the village from Darkspawn. That was the plan, wasn't it? That's how being a warden worked. The blood's right there. What do you sense?" Evka asked quietly, then added, "And try not to block it out this time." Antoine flushed. It wasn't that he tried to block it out, he just didn't. He pushed the complaints from his mind and tried to focus. The crowd shifted behind him, out of view but distracting. "These people are scared." He took a deep breath. The air was still heavy and damp. "It's going to rain again." "And?" Evka prompted. Antoine closed his eyes and listened for the sick song that pulled at the corners of his mind and gave him a headache whenever Darkspawn were nearby. The song made him feel on edge. When he got too close, it was loud and it made him think of things he didn't want to. But he felt fine. There was nothing there. "It's not Darkspawn," he said. Mina's defiance broke through the warden lesson. "You're wrong. Darkspawn don't take a single person at a time. Not like this," Evka said. "Your brother fought. There's blood on that axe, and it's not the right blood. It wasn't them." The crowd erupted into a chorus of resignation and distrust. So you'll
The
leave?
Warden's promise only goes for Darkspawn, doesn't it?
Why come here, then? Antoine held up his hands, hoping the crowd would quiet. This wasn't how it was supposed to go, but it was fine. The plan had shifted, but he could adjust.
Something is after you. We know that much. We won't leave you at its mercy.
They wouldn't, right? He glanced back at Evka and she gave him a slight nod.
Let us try. There's no harm in that.
The crowd continued to grumble, but gave up the argument and wandered home, leaving the Wardens alone with Mina.
Why does no one sing for help?
Antoine asked.
Because Eichweil's cursed, Mina said. That's what people say, and we're either too far out or too maker-damned for folks to bother with our bad luck, or they show up and die too. We didn't come here to abandon you, Antoine said. That's not what the Wardens do.
Then prove it, Mina snapped. She took a deep breath and gave the Wardens the first and only hopeful look they'd received.
Please,
she said, then turned and went inside the house.
That's not what Wardens do? Evka asked with a smirk.
It's not what I would do, Antoine said. So there were no Darkspawn to stop. There was still a village to save. That was something. He could work with that.
Yeah, me neither, Evka said.
Any idea who did this?
None.
But we can handle it. Evka's smile was dangerous.
That's the idea.
When they got back to the inn, Verschel had rooms ready for them. Antoine's was comfortable, if drafty. He had the feeling everything was drafty here. When he closed his eyes, he dreamed the dream he always did. When he opened them, it was still dark. A tree branch beat arrhythmic patterns on the window, and there was a strange, hollow moaning that Antoine wasn't entirely sure was the wind. What happened there? Evka asked as the Wardens followed Verschel and Mina through the village the next day. If Eichweil was colorless at night, daylight did it few favors. If anything, the streets and buildings were somehow grayer. Verschel barely gave the burned-out building a glance.
Rogue mages, postates. 5 years back now. Made some stand against those chasing them. Raised a bunch of demons or became them. Not sure which.
What about that house? Antoine asked when they reached the market square, suppressing a yawn and gesturing toward the boarded-up building they'd passed the night before.
Renke's place,
Mina said.
Belonged to a couple of nobles down on funds, Verschel explained. Old ones were fine, but the son, he thought he was owed something. Poisoned our only chantry brother when the man caught him thieving. We ran him out last winter.
So when you said your village was cursed, Evka said, in addition to the apostates and the murderous noble's son, they learned about the blacksmith's possessed donkey, seen the sight of a freak lightning strike, and heard about the bandit gang that attempted to hold Eichweil hostage, until they realized no one cared.
If you're looking for a reason in the attacks, there's no sense in it, Verschel said. It's always one thing or another, just the way it is.
Right, Evka said. Mina had offered to show the Wardens the other attack sites, prompting Verschel to follow since no one else got the order right. There were dark circles under Mina's eyes, and she hadn't said much. But she watched the Wardens closely, waiting for them to find answers at every stop. It wasn't going to happen. Each site revealed signs of a powerful something entering Eichweil, but little else. The other villagers answered questions, but otherwise took no interest, accepting the Warden's failure as inevitable.
"There's no point in you to dine here,"
said a cherry-faced woman, barely sparing them a glance from the candles she was making.
"You do that, and who's left with the mess when your next of kin comes looking, huh?"
"We don't have next of kin," Evka said. "At least none that come looking."
"There's still a mess,"
huffed the candlemaker, and waited for the Wardens to leave.
"There's still the woods," Antoine said, after they examined a goat shed with indistinct scratch marks on the walls. Evka stared out at the thick ring of trees that encircled the village.
That's a lot of ground and no place to start. We lost a hunter in there a month back, Mina offered. We don't know where exactly, but the trail should have taken him past the split rock. Then we track the creature wherever it lives and stop it before it returns, Antoine said, as if that ending were inevitable, enthusiasm making his mouth run faster than his brain.
You do that, Vershel said. Not long after, Evka and Antoine were far enough into the trees that Grey Eichweil was hidden from view. A crow screamed from the rattling branches of a nearby tree.
That's cheerful, Evka said, watching the crow take off into the overcast skies.
What's a cursed village without atmosphere? Antoine teased. He was enjoying himself, but then he enjoyed everything. Despite leaving Eichweil almost immediately, he'd managed to buy a half-dozen sweet rolls, which he didn't seem interested in eating, and a series of silver cylinders that were supposed to give off sparks when properly lit. The latter had reportedly come from a Kunari trader. Evka suspected he'd been swindled. At least he shared the rolls.
There it is,
Antoine said, as they broke through a stand of trees. Up ahead, a large split boulder sat in a small clearing.
Where do we start?
By looking, Evka said.
For what?
Anything.
We know it's not Darkspawn, he said, starting to explore the clearing.
There's that, Evka said. The ground was still wet from the previous night's rain. Damp leaves clung to each other in giant clumps.
You're disappointed. Darkspawn we could sense, whether you want to or not, she added,
catching the look on Antoine's face. She continued her search. Darkspawn would be easy. Darkspawn she could handle. She could even keep Antoine alive while doing so. Probably.
The rains washed everything away, Antoine called.
Not everything, Evka said. A graying, waterlogged arm lay in the leaves, its fingers curved and contorted upward like a dead spider. Punctures and tears in the flesh implied the work of teeth, and large ones. There was no sign of the rest of the body. Antoine drew a quick breath as he came up beside her. Whatever had attacked Eichweil was no less daunting than a Darkspawn. Not knowing what it was made it worse. Evka signaled to Antoine to ready his bow, then led them away from the arm, down a nearby animal track. Evka was a skilled tracker underground, and her above-ground skills weren't bad. Enough to give her something to go on at least. Moving half on actual clues, half on hunch, she led them further into the trees. The forest was as silent as they were. No more crows. No periodic rustle of small rodents. Then, there was a buzz of flies. The Wardens exchanged a look and kept moving. The buzzing grew louder. A dark mound rose on the path up ahead. The last of the autumn insects flew drunkenly over it, swarming over the raw flesh.
Just a ram,
Evka breathed, relieved but not enough to speak at full volume. The relay faded with a glance at Antoine.
What is it?
Antoine's eyes were darting around the scene, the way they did when he was thinking a lot of things at once. He moved carefully toward the dead ram, his hand tracing the path of twisting entrails in the air.
It's not been eaten, he said.
He was right. Evka felt a chill despite herself.
An animal would have eaten this.
Idlur? Antoine asked.
A call.
The voice came from the trees, cold and scraping like an axe over stone. Evka had her own axe ready before it could finish the words. Antoine whipped his bow in the direction of the sound.
Then we're called,
Evka said, keeping her voice cold. If it wanted to scare them, she wouldn't give it that edge.
Not for you. Not yet. For my own.
The voice was behind them now. Antoine spun around. Evka moved to stand with her back to his. But nothing emerged from the woods around them. The wind began to pick up, and with it a strange, hollow moaning. She felt Antoine take a step away from her. He looked pale, and his face held a look of troubled concentration, the way it did when he was trying to shut out Darkspawn. But that's not what this was. Still, he kept his bow on the trees. Then the moaning stopped. "He's gone," Antoine said, unusually subdued. "Antoine?" A slow roll of thunder sounded overhead. The crow from before, or perhaps a different one, let out a scream. Antoine looked at Evka and smiled brightly, as if nothing had happened. "Shall we beat the rain to Wuschel's?" "Sure," she said. She watched the elf carefully on the way back, but he seemed fine. In Antoine's dream, he was dying. Darkspawn had attacked, and their blood was poisoning him. It burned, and he couldn't think straight. Sometimes it felt like nothing. And that was just as bad. The plan was to lie there. The backup plan was to die. Then a dwarf was asking him a question. Antoine woke with a start. There was a dwarf watching him with an amused expression on her face. Ready? He'd fallen asleep sitting up in the inn's small dining room. His untouched supper sat cold in front of him. He ran a hand over his face to wake himself up, and grinned at Evka. "On y va." The butchered ram and strange voice in the woods were enough of a bad sign that they decided to patrol the village that night. They didn't know what they were patrolling for, but it felt suitably heroic. It was closer to how Antoine imagined warden life than anything else that had happened. They'd managed to convince Verschel and a few others to help. The agreements were grudging, but since 2 wardens couldn't cover the entire village by themselves, it was better than nothing. "Do we know anything?" Antoine asked, as they went to check the path to Mina's house for the 3rd time. "Only that trouble that talks back is the worst kind," Evka shrugged, then gave him a probing look that made his chest tighten. There'd been something strange about the voice in the woods, but he couldn't explain it. He'd just try to block it out. "Should we—" Antoine froze. That sound was on the wind again. The same one he'd heard on the road where they'd met Mina, in the inn last night, and in the woods that afternoon. The sound that the villagers must have been hearing for weeks. Reedy, hollow, moaning. It made him feel sick and defiant. He wanted it to go away. Then a new sound joined the first, high-pitched, terrified, and human. The sound jarred Antoine back to his senses. He took off for the market square with Evka at his heels. Despite their fear, a ring of villagers surrounded the well that stood in front of the boarded-up Renke house. As Antoine squeezed through the crowd, he caught sight of the blacksmith's thick arms and tangled hair, of his blank eyes, and the thread of intestines looping away from his torn middle. The man had been one of the volunteers. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "You!" spat a voice from the crowd. "What good are you?" "I don't—" Antoine couldn't see who'd spoken, and then it was everyone.
"I can't stop
It's
this."
always the same.
They let him die.
What difference does it make? "We didn't, as it is still here?" someone asked. The hollow moaning that swelled from all around gave them an answer. The crowd started to panic. Antoine was finding it hard to focus. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "Everyone, you need to—" A throat-wrenching scream cut the words short as a man was dragged down from the edge of the square. In seconds, he was yanked from the lantern lights of the other villagers and into the darkness. Then the screaming stopped. The crowd erupted into screams of their own. Antoine, there! Through the press of people running, he saw Evka moving toward the shadow that had started all of this. Antoine swallowed and ran after her. No matter what the strange voice was or the hollow moaning, Wardens didn't run away. If he did, these people... Evka... Antoine ran faster. The shadow, the creature, barreled away from the square and the shouting villagers. Whatever this thing was, it was fast. And big. Very big. It ran on all fours, its gait overly stretched, uncanny but efficient. They couldn't let it get away. But it was. It was getting away. The creature veered down the uneven path that led to the now ownerless smithy. Antoine realized Evka was no longer with him, but he couldn't stop now. If the beast cleared the smithy, it would be in the trees. It would escape. He wasn't going to catch it in a straight chase. He needed a plan. His only hope was to make it around the smithy first. He darted from the path, cutting what he hoped was a faster trail and praying the beast wouldn't change course. He made it in time, but barely. The beast charged in from the left, and then again from the right with Evka chasing after it. A call. But not for them. For its own. There was more than one. Antoine released an arrow, but he was too slow. The beasts veered off and bolted for the woods. The Wardens raced after them. Antoine reached the tree line first. It was still. Silent. Where had they gone? He needed a plan, any plan, but there wasn't time. With a snarl, one of the creatures leapt from the shadows at Evka. She dodged just in time, cursing as she did. Antoine fired a shot, and there was the sound of an arrow driving through flesh. The beast let out a cry, twisting mid-leap, and raced back into the trees. Antoine plunged in after it. Injured now, the beast didn't run as quietly. Antoine could hear it crashing through the underbrush. The beast was still fast, but Antoine was gaining on it. He leaped over a gnarled root, ignoring the branch that struck him across the face. Up ahead, the beast had paused and was pacing back and forth. Antoine readied his bow and fired. Before the arrow reached its mark, the beast vanished. Antoine blinked. That couldn't be right. It was just... gone. When Evka caught up to Antoine, the elf had his bow lowered, uncertain. There was a line of blood on his face, but he didn't seem to notice. "What happened?" Evka asked. "It disappeared," Antoine said. "It can disappear." Evka turned in a slow circle. Disappeared. To where? "We need light," Antoine murmured. "That will show them where we are," she said, if they didn't know already. Had the beasts fled? Or were they watching? "It was up here," Antoine said, moving ahead to show her the way. Evka caught Antoine by the arm before he vanished himself. The leaves were scrambled here. Clawed. What little light there was showed dark drops of blood on the forest floor, all leading to a deep fissure that opened in the ground in front of them. It would have been difficult to see during the day. It was almost invisible in the dark. "That's how your beast disappeared," Evka said. "Or it did vanish and the fissure's a ruse," Antoine teased even now. "I'll go first." "In the dark?" Not so teasing anymore. Evka lowered herself down first, and they climbed carefully into the fissure. To Antoine's credit, he managed not to fall. It was even harder to see at the bottom, but Evka could make out claw marks in the soft earth. Not that it mattered. With sheer rock walls rising on either side, there was only one direction they could go. The Wardens remained silent as they moved down the shadowy chasm. A brighter sheet of moonlight up ahead signaled that they were about to move back into the open. They didn't move very far. With a reedy howl, 4 beasts emerged from the trees in front of them. They walked upright, but it didn't look comfortable. Their limbs were overlong, their movements jerky and awkward. But when they ran, they dropped to all fours. Dark, patchy fur rose in spiky hackles on their necks. They snarled as they charged, muzzles full of sharp teeth, yellow eyes lit with malice. Shit! Evka swung at their attackers. She hadn't sensed them up ahead. This was why Darkspawn were easier.
Le loup-garou!
Antoine cried as he dodged clear. What? Evka struck at a silver-furred monster, but it leaped away. Werewolves! Antoine said. The creatures were circling now, keeping the Wardens penned in. Evka kept her eyes on the silver beast.
Not something we had underground. Did you have these in Orlais?
No. Maybe? I don't know, Antoine said. They were just stories. The werewolves continued to circle, waiting to catch their prey off guard.
What do you know?
Evka said. Did I mention they were stories?
Do you have a better plan?
Right, Antoine said. It's a curse. A large black werewolf broke from the ring and lunged at Evka. She blocked the snapping jaws with the handle of her axe. Don't let them bite, Antoine said. It's how the curse spits. Evka had no intention of letting that happen. She twisted the axe handle upward, wrenching the werewolf's jaw sideways, and kicked the beast away. Antoine fired an arrow at the creature's feet, massive paws with long fingers and claws, and it danced back. As the black werewolf retreated, the silver beast charged again, followed by another with roan fur. Evka swung around and caught the silver beast in the shoulder, sending it back out of reach. Antoine dodged and fired at his own attacker, again the shot landing near its feet, causing the beast to jump away.
They were human,
Antoine called. She could hear the regret in his voice.
They're still trying to kill us.
I know. Taking advantage of her distraction, the black werewolf came at Evka from behind. She wasn't going to turn in time. She saw its frenzied eyes, its sharp teeth. It fell dead at her feet, an arrow between its eyes. Evka and Antoine stood back to back as the remaining werewolves circled once more. On your left, Evka shouted as the silver beast took the lead, charging toward the Wardens at full speed. Antoine spun so he was facing the werewolf. His shot caught the beast in the ribs and Evka darted forward. Her axe was in its throat before it could make another move. As she pulled her weapon from the now silent creature, Antoine turned and took down the roan wolf with a volley of arrows. Just one left. The remaining werewolf rose on its hind legs and took a lurching step toward Antoine. It was a clean shot, but Antoine just stared as if stunned by the unnerving change in its posture. Evka readied her axe and raced to meet it. Wait! Antoine yelled, throwing himself between the dwarf and the werewolf. What are you?
This one never charged.
That doesn't... The werewolf fell back to its knees and whimpered. Help! The word came out like a choke, as if formed by chords not meant for speech. Evka swore. Antoine was walking slowly toward the werewolf, weapon lowered, that friendly smile on his face, though his eyes were at least wary.
What's your name?
Antoine asked, his voice light, as if talking to a child.
Willem.
The werewolf coughed. It sounded almost sulky.
Mina's brother,
Evka breathed. Antoine glanced at Evka, and the look on his face matched how she felt. But when he turned back to Willem, it was as if they'd met on a late-night walk, as if nothing were wrong. If the kid weren't a werewolf, she'd have almost believed it herself.
It's nice to meet you, Willem. Your sister thought you might be alive. She asked for us to help.
I didn't kill. I didn't. It was others.
Willem was frantic.
Mina.
She's safe,
Antoine said. The werewolf trembled.
This curse,
Evka said softly.
If there isn't a way, There may be one, Antoine said. He sounded more hopeful than sure, but she'd asked. Evka exhaled slowly. All right, she said, then turned to the werewolf. Willem, you need to come back with us.
I can't. I might hurt.
Willem whimpered. It's all right, Antoine said. He gestured to Evka's griffin insignia. We are Grey Wardens. You won't hurt anyone, Evka said. You have my word. Evka knew that Antoine wanted the part where they saved the village. They would do what they had to. That's what wardens do. But she could worry about that later. In his dream, he was dying. With a tired groan, Antoine pulled himself out of bed. He skipped breakfast and headed straight for the stable out back. Thick chains held Willem to the back of the stall. Thick chains sealed the door as well, and a large heavy table had been pushed against it for good measure. Verschel's elderly Grey had been moved to a neighbor's barn, unable to be anywhere near the young werewolf. Antoine sat on the table by the open half door and tried to look encouraging. What happened then? Evka asked.
I was hurt. I was hungry. I was this.
Although he had room to walk around the small space, Willem sat, pressed against the far wall. Antoine didn't think he feared the Wardens. If the villagers had been unimpressed with the Wardens before, they were furious with them now. Bringing a werewolf back with them, they were supposed to be protecting the village, or failing at it, not making things worse. It was only the reputation of the larger Warden Order and Verschel's grumpy backing that kept Evka and Antoine from being run out of Eichweil, and Willem from being torn apart. The only other person on their side was Mina. She'd insisted on being present, although she wouldn't come too close. Does it hurt? Mina asked, her frame rigid.
I can't. I want to go home.
Willem wrapped his overlong limbs around himself. Mina looked away, her posture a mirror of her brother's. The stories are all the same, Antoine said. A demon possesses a wolf or a human and spreads its curse. The hero kills the source and the curse ends. A demon explains the voice in the woods, Evka said. Have you heard it, Willem? Do you know where it is? Willem rocked back and forth. Was it near the split rock? Evka tried again, but the werewolf didn't answer. Come on, Will, Mina said. Willem snarled and his sister jumped back.
You were gone.
Mina swallowed. She took a few steps closer, but her brother shifted, his hackles rising slightly, and she froze again. I found Wardens. If you've heard this voice, you have to tell them.
I don't. I'm not.
Ignoring the look Evka gave him, Antoine leaned casually over the stall door. It's hard not having the answers. Right now, we're working off what I remember from stories. That's our whole plan. It's not very good, is it? Evka scowled, but Willem had fallen quiet. Anything you say will be more than we know now, Antoine continued, which means you don't have to say much, and anything you do say helps.
Chantry!
Willem coughed. The chantry won't help now, Evka murmured.
The castle!
Mina joined Antoine at the door. The broken chantry. It's a ruin in the woods, north of here. We built a fort there, a castle. No one could find us. We haven't been back since. She flicked a hand, dismissing the thought, and pressed on. They say the brothers and sisters were off. The place went up in flames 30 years ago. Besides us, no one's been back.
Of course, Evka said.
Thank you, Willem, Antoine said. All right, bad plan or not, what do the stories say next? Evka asked. Antoine smiled. That's it. The hero kills the demon, the curse ends, they all live happily, and so on. This was more like it.
And me?
Willem asked. Antoine took a deep breath before turning back to the boy. You wait here for the story to end. Antoine, Evka murmured. Antoine turned to her with a grin. Back to work, yes? Outside the stable, the crowd alternated between glaring at the Wardens and pretending they hadn't been listening. Antoine smiled at them. It was only partially overcast for once, and the Wardens had a plan, or at least a location, and a village to save, whether the villagers believed it or not. We off to defeat some werewolves or die trying, Antoine announced. If the former, you're in luck. If the latter, you're no worse off. The crowd stared at him, speechless. Evka snickered, and Antoine's grin broadened. All right, Evka said. Let's go. The road that led to the broken chantry was barely visible, concealed by almost 3 decades of overgrowth. To make their lives harder, a mist had rolled in which Antoine called ambiance, and Evka put on the same list as she did rain. Antoine marched a few paces ahead, ready to save the day. Or he thought he was. Antoine? Yes? He gave her a confused smile. He was off guard. That worked in her favor. When we find the leader, we can't be gentle. I know. But that wasn't the only thing on her mind. If Willem doesn't... We aren't there yet, Antoine said. His fingers twitched at his side, as if he were counting something. More plans, more ideas of how this might end. Wardens don't save everyone. No. But we try. She took a deep breath. Are you a liability? It wasn't that she didn't trust him. He'd stood at her back. But that wasn't the point. The hurt on his face twisted at her. And of all the heroic warden traits he tried to embody, she wished he'd included the Order's fabled stoicism. We need to save Willem, he said, pacing away and then back again. He won't be the only one at risk if we're not careful. If you don't want me to, I don't want you to die. He stopped and looked at her. He was standing very still. It made her nervous when he stood that still. It meant he was focusing 100 thoughts on something, and right now that something was her. The forest was very quiet. Where was that damn crow when you needed it? Then, Antoine's expression changed. Why are you smiling? He laughed. I don't know. You don't want me to die. And that's your response? He was standing very still again. Evka, I'll do everything I can. I know. She started walking again before the conversation could continue. Without warning, the stone walls of the broken chantry rose up out of the fog. Evka tapped Antoine's arm and led them over to a tangle of wild rose bushes. They ducked, and she surveyed the building. Ivy grew over the walls, pushing through cracks and empty window frames. One of the side walls had collapsed, and half the roof had caved in. The main door was rotted away, but somehow the stained glass sun still glimmered faintly above the entry. They could try circling the building, but it was hard to tell how large the chantry was in the mist, or how much cover they would have as they moved. Front door's as good as any, she said. The arched entry opened onto a large stone floor,
covered in leaves. Mist skirted around a handful of benches, blackened remains of the worshippers who once gathered there. The stone platform at the far end, where sisters must have sung the chant of light, now staged a fallen tree.
Do you think it's...
A low moaning cut off Antoine's thought.
We need to draw it out,
Evka said.
Unit.
She heard the strike of flint and turned to see Antoine fiddling with the Kunari cylinders, the ones that he had bought the day before. Bright white sparks burst from the tube.
It works,
Antoine said, delight replacing unease. Then,
ah!
As the sparks started streaming faster, and he tossed the tube away from himself. It skittered into the fog, briefly illuminating a large silhouette, before going dark.
The boy gave us away. Predictable.
The voice came out of the fog, cold and echoing. It was the same voice they'd heard by the ram. Consider yourself called, Evka said, hurling a knife through the mist. It made a useless clattering sound as it landed on the ground out of sight.
Did you leave the boy alive?
The voice came from the left.
Your curse hasn't taken him,
Antoine said.
It will,
the voice said.
He will hunger, and who will be in his way? His sister.
You know them, Evka said. Eichweil hadn't been struck by a random curse. It was a targeted one. Given the village's overall luck, she didn't know if that was better or worse.
Yes,
said the voice, and the werewolf stepped out of the fog. It was massive, easily twice the size of the other werewolves they'd faced. Its fur was jet black and its mouth dripped with foam. Evka dodged as the werewolf lunged forward, smashing one of the remaining benches to pieces. "Who are you?" Evka asked. The voice sounded, smaller for a moment, but no less cruel.
They cast me from their cursed village, as if I wanted it.
Antoine took a shot, but the werewolf slid clear and disappeared back into the mist.
He did want it. He wanted it all.
The voice was deeper again, laced through with something darker. Antoine shook his head, as if trying to dislodge something. The werewolf charged again, bursting from the fog and barging into Evka, knocking her to the ground. She rolled clear of its massive, long-fingered paws and jumped back to her feet. Antoine loosed a volley of arrows, but the beast barely noticed. Evka swore internally. Whatever the creature was in the flesh, it would draw strength from the demon possessing it. The werewolf turned its yellow eyes on Antoine and howled. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the broken chantry. Antoine took another shot, but the werewolf struck out, knocking the elf into another bench, his bow falling from his grasp. "Who are you?" Evka yelled again, trying to draw the werewolf's attention back to her. The beast's voice lost its echo. "They left me for dead. I took what was mine." "Renka," Evka said, remembering the tour of Eichweil, the noble's son who'd murdered the chantry brother. The sound of the name drew the beast's focus. It stalked lazily toward her. Its voice doubled again.
It was winter. He didn't know how to escape the woods. He was starving. He hungered. Then he hungered for more. We will feast on Eichweil.
Then back to a single chord. After I watched them writhe. "What are you now?" Evka asked, holding her axe ready. Demons could be a lot of things. Pride, desire, fear. But they always loved talking about themselves. What had possessed the noble's son? Behind the monster that was Renka. Antoine pulled himself to his feet.
Renka was starving,
the werewolf snarled.
I answered.
"What are you?" Evka shouted. "Hunger," Antoine said. Before Evka could react, Renka charged forward and grabbed the axe's handle in his jaws. With a twist of his head, both dwarf and weapon were sailing across the room. Evka heard a crack as she hit the wall. A rotting support beam swung loose, pinning her down. "Evka!" Antoine yelled. He tried to run to her, but the werewolf whipped around and pinned Antoine to the ground with its massive bulk. Even through his leather overcoat, the beast's dark claws drove into his shoulders, threatening to break the skin. He wasn't sure it was enough for the curse to set in. He didn't want to find out.
"So, you can guess a name."
Antoine's head ached as the demon-possessing Renka tried to access his thoughts. When the Darkspawn song was in his head, it sang of a death in his future. The demon grasped at the one in his past.
"Ah, yes. You have hungered. When you were dying, what did that feel like?"
It burned, and he couldn't think straight. It felt like nothing, and that was just as bad. "That's over," Antoine said. He focused on the memory of Evka's voice telling him what had happened. He was a warden now. A hero. The demon laughed.
"Did you think you'd escaped?"
Antoine struggled beneath Renke's paws. He needed a way out. He needed a plan.
"What you have's not what you thought it is. You're deprived the admiration, the heroics."
No, that wasn't right. That's not what this is about. Antoine tried to shift his arms beneath the werewolf's weight. It's not what it was supposed to be about.
"Would they sate you?"
Antoine's fingers brushed the end of his bow, but it was out of reach. That wasn't going to work.
"You will join me. You will devour what you thought to save."
Antoine's other hand knocked one of the silver cylinders loose from his belt. It rolled across the uneven chantry floor with a small plinking noise. He reached again, his hand closing around glass. Renke lowered a tooth-filled jaw to Antoine's ear.
"Tell me, elf, are you hungry?"
Evka pushed herself free of the beam, grabbed her axe, and ran toward Antoine. The werewolf reared back, its jaws open. She wasn't going to make it. Antoine twisted sideways, one arm flailing upward. Renke's jaw snapped shut, and the chantry filled with a dark, billowing smoke. Renke roared. "What?" Evka said, startled. "It's a distraction!" She heard an arrow pierce flesh at close range. Renke howled again. "That's not a warning," Evka said. Through the trailing ends of the smoke, they could see the werewolf take off. By the time the fog cleared, it was gone. "We'll think of a plan," Antoine said for the third time. The Wardens were in the inn's dining room, with Virgil, Mina, and several other villagers who'd come for news of the Warden's success, or lack thereof. "We were holding Renke for the king's justice. Bastard got away," Virgil said. "With the snows, we figured running him out was just as good. Figured him dead." "He nearly was," Antoine replied. "But something found him." "I thought you were going to kill werewolves or die trying. You failed at both," said the candlemaker. There were nods of agreement. "If you want to borrow my axe, I'll give you a turn at it," Evka said. The candlemaker pursed her lips, but said nothing. "We'll think of a plan," Antoine said for the fourth time, then turned for the door. "Where are you going?" Evka asked. "To check on Willem," he said. He couldn't stay there. He needed to do something. Antoine could hear the inhuman growling coming from the stable before he went inside. Willem paced back and forth on all fours, snarling and frothing at the mouth, stopping only to pull against the thick chains that were just strong enough to hold him. "Willem, if there's anything you can tell us," Antoine said. "Antoine." Evka had followed him. Mina hovered in the doorway, refusing to cross over the entrance. Antoine ignored them. "Even a weird. We just need to stop him." But the werewolf was past the point of gentle words and a friendly smile. "You tried," Mina said, but she sounded like everyone else in Eichval. Unimpressed, unenthused. She walked away, tears running down her face. Antoine didn't move from the stable door. "I'm still trying." Willem leapt for the door, or more likely for Antoine himself. Antoine jumped back, startled, while the chains yanked Willem down in the opposite direction. They wouldn't hold forever. Evka touched Antoine lightly on the arm. He didn't want to think about what happened to Willem now. He turned without looking at her and left the stable, stalking back to the main street. His eyes darted to the buildings, down side paths, his fingers twitching, his mind working. He came to the well and stopped. This wasn't how it was supposed to be.
"What you have's not what you thought, is it?"
Even when it wasn't in his head, it was in his head. He kicked the well in frustration. "You regret that, don't you?" Evka said lightly. Antoine laughed, despite himself. "Yes." He tapped his foot gingerly on the ground a few times, then sank down and sat with his back to the well, staring at the boarded-up Renke house. "I should have died," he said finally. "I've pointed that out," Evka said. "I didn't want to. If a demon had found me, would I?" He gestured at Renke's house. "It didn't," Evka said. "So it doesn't matter. I woke up with the second chance. If I don't do everything with it, what's the point?"
"Would that sate you?"
Antoine's fingers twitched. He tried again. "If what I do with it isn't... Maybe I'm not..." But he didn't know how to finish the thought. Evka sat down next to Antoine. "Here's what I know about being a Grey Warden. You fight the worst monsters in Thedas. Most people don't notice, and then you do it again. We've got a thankless village, a werewolf we've barely been able to hit. A demon that can get into my head," Antoine offered. "And that. That's what Wardens do. We take all of that and handle it. Because someone has to. You're a warden because everything else that could go wrong has. And you're still here." She punched him gently on the shoulder and smiled. "All we need is a plan." All he wanted was to sit at the well with her a little longer. But there was work to do. They needed a plan. He jumped to his feet, took a few steps toward Renke's house, and then back to the well. They had a thankless village, a werewolf they'd been barely able to hit. "Do you have a plan?" Evka asked. "Not a good one," Antoine said. "It's a start." Antoine grinned. Evka stood alone by the well. It was dark. The moon was the thinnest curl it could be, but at least it was out. Behind her, lights flickered in the Renke house. She let out a slow breath. She could hear Willem start to howl, his transformed cries carrying from the direction of the inn. And they were answered. Evka gripped her axe a little tighter. "Renke!" she yelled. There was a moment of silence. Then the voice came out of the shadows.
"Waiting for me."
There was no other sound except Willem's howling. They'd killed 3 werewolves in the woods and faced Renke alone in the chantry. "Just you?" she said casually.
"Not for long,"
Renke replied. Alone for now, then. That was one thing in their favor. Maybe. Evka had a feeling it only made Renke more dangerous.
"Where's your friend?"
"I don't like the way you talk to him," she said. Renke's cold laughter was cut off by the bang of a shutter behind her. When the voice spoke again, It lost some of its echo. "That's mine." "You count on them being separated. We can't guard everywhere at once." "One house. I can watch that." She glanced behind her at the flickering lights, the shadows moving behind the shutters. Evka smiled at Renke. No one was using this one.
"It's mine!"
Renke yelled. The beast erupted from the shadows and crossed the distance between them in a few long strides. Evka couldn't hope to be faster than the werewolf, but she'd fought this one already. Before the words were out of its mouth, she rolled to the side and struck out with her axe. Renke dodged, but Evka already had a knife in her hand. Evka whipped the knife hard, and it was met with a satisfying yowl as it sunk deep into Renke's shoulder. It wasn't enough to stop the beast. She didn't know what that would take. But she took advantage of the wolf's momentary pain to run clear of its thrashing and place herself between it and the front door.
"You want to protect these people. You've gathered them for a feast."
Renke's voice reverberated. Evka stood her ground and waited. If she was right, the beast would charge. And it did. Evka held her position as the werewolf raced forward, claws and teeth ready to tear through the dwarf in its way. At the last moment, Evka ducked and rolled to the side. The werewolf slammed past her and through the front door. Antoine watched from the stairs as a storm of splinters burst inward, followed by Renke. The beast's eyes shone and saliva foamed from its jaws, dipping to the worn floorboards. It snapped a chair in half and hurled the broken pieces across the room before blinking, confusion starting to show on its contorted face. A fire burned in the fireplace. Lanterns flickered against the walls, casting shadows through the room, especially when Antoine tugged on the rope attached to them.
"What is this?"
The werewolf snarled. "A trap," Antoine said. The villagers didn't like the Wardens, but after the disastrous patrol they were willing to darken their houses and stay out of sight. It wasn't much, but it was all they needed. He tugged on the lanterns again. Did it work? The werewolf howled as Evka raced through the door and sunk her axe into its hind leg. Inside the Renke house, there was no shadows for the werewolf to hide in, no room for the beast to run from the range of Evka's axe. She sliced at its legs, its shoulders, its ribs. While Renke crashed and twisted to fight, Evka ducked and moved around it. From his place on the stairs, Antoine fired down on the thrashing monster. The beast was bleeding, and there was a ragged sound to its breathing. They had it. Until they didn't. With a swiftness that suggested it wasn't as injured as they thought, the werewolf hurled itself at Evka, knocking her to the stone fireplace. She gasped as the air escaped her lungs. Before she could draw another breath, Renke grabbed her and slammed her to the ground. Antoine fired an arrow, but the beast shrugged it off. A ropey string of drool oozed down onto Evka's face. Then a sweet roll smacked the werewolf in the head. "Renke," Antoine said. "Are you hungry?" Renke twisted and ran for the stairs faster than Antoine had expected. He scrambled backward and launched himself into the upper hallway, the werewolf chasing after. Antoine ran a few paces, then threw himself sideways through an open door, barely avoiding Renke as the monster barreled down the hall. Antoine found himself in a dusty bedroom. His fingers twitched. Modest size, no exits except for the hall and a window that faced the main road. He was cornered. Throwing the sweet roll hadn't been much of a plan, but it had worked. Now he needed another one, and he didn't have a lot of time to think. The monster that was Renke stood in the doorway. It howled an awful, empty moaning sound, then stood and walked forward with an unnatural, halting gait.
"Another chance, and this life could be even better. You can taste it."
"No," Antoine said. He could hear the truth in the words. But he was a warden. His job was to handle it anyway. He raised his bow, but Renke was too close. The werewolf knocked the weapon aside before Antoine could level it and grabbed the elf by the throat. That was another thing wardens did. They died fighting the monster. But Renke didn't want him dead.
The werewolf tightened its clawed hand, and Antoine felt the skin break. Blood trickled down his neck.
You'll devour all those fools who didn't care after you gnaw on the dwarf's bones.
You're wrong, Antoine said. Renke flicked a pointed ear back.
There she is now.
Evka stood in the doorway, axe ready. But she was too late. Renke sunk his teeth into Antoine's shoulder. Antoine screamed. With a satisfied smile, Renke dropped the elf on the floor. You're dead, Evka said. Evka, Antoine said. As heroic as dying facing monsters sounded, he didn't want to die. Not you, Evka said. He reached for the pouches at his waist. Evka! Distraction! Evka was already moving as the room filled with white sparks, the light blinding in the small space. Renke snarled, then screamed as Evka's axe sank deep into its back. Antoine barely managed to throw himself out of the way as the monster lurched forward. Evka let go of the axe handle and jumped to the bed. Planting a foot firmly on the mattress, she leaped upward. As she came down, she drove her last knife into Renke. The beast's final howl was cut short as Evka drew the blade along its throat. As she finished, Antoine pulled himself up and kicked Renke with all the strength he had left. The beast stumbled forward and crashed through the window. It hit the ground below with a sickening crack. Evka was blinking hard. I thought you were going to use the vials. You knew that one already. It's only a warning if I know what you're warning me about. Evka blinked again, then gave Antoine a look. You almost died. Stop laughing when I say that. He grinned. He hadn't died. They hadn't died. They had beaten a werewolf, and Antoine was still breathing. And, Evka was standing very close to him. We should, make sure it's dead. Antoine touched his shoulder where Renke had bit him. Ending the night as a werewolf was not how it was supposed to work. A small crowd was cautiously approaching Renke's former house, drawn by the silence that had followed the battle inside. The werewolf's eyes were dull and empty, its spine bent at an odd angle. Antoine didn't know if they'd killed the demon inside or if it had fled. Either way, it appeared to be gone. There's that done, Verschel said, giving the beast a sullen kick and watching it flop lifelessly back. He looked at Antoine. You worked that then? It was the highest praise they could ask for. Mina didn't say anything. She was running for the inn. Evka watched as Antoine said goodbye to the people of Eichweil. The villagers were as grudging and unenthusiastic in their thanks as they were about most things. But Antoine smiled as if they'd thrown the Wardens a parade. If there was any doubt of Renke's curse being gone, the brown-haired boy with wolf-yellow eyes put it to rest. Mina had an arm around the boy's shoulder, and the pair waved to them as they left. So, we rode to town, Antoine said. We walked because we lost the horses. Saved the horses and the village. To thunderous applause, and it will probably be overrun by locusts when we leave. What now? He asked. Weishapt Fortress, she said. The part of being a warden where we report where we're supposed to and not get told what to do without being sidetracked. Bien sûr, on y va. Noti to us. His grin said he didn't believe the last part. She wasn't sure she did either. Small, banished, powerless. But if it waited, it would sense the knot that twisted its victim, the weakness that followed, the opening, the longing. And just before the blackness fell, when they would do almost anything, it would whisper,
Are you hungry?
This has been Tevinter Nights. Hunger
Written by Brianne Battier and read by Kyle Bond. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time.